Hello, Patricia. What I would request is if you have any questions to put it in the Q&A chat box. And if you've got any hellos and hi's to say or anything general, to use the chat feature. So the Q&A chat box for any questions that you want to ask. Let's give it a couple of minutes more. Let any colleagues, any other people joining in. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining in today to our session on culture excellence, turning theory into action. This probably is the first time that we're talking a bit about, or rather about the action bit. Our webinars traditionally on culture have been about the survey itself. So this particular one is a step away from the ones that we do usually, and that is probably the reason why it's garnered a lot of attention. I can see we've got about 400 people who've already joined in. We've got a limit on Zoom, so when that limit hits, people will not be able to log in. What I would suggest is that we're also live streaming this on YouTube. So please go ahead, log into our YouTube channel, BRCGS YouTube channel, and you should be able to see a live stream of this. So any colleagues of yours who kind of walk up to you and say, you're on this webinar, I'm not able to join in, just say, if you were there first, you would have also been able to join in, but here's another option of going to the BRCGS YouTube channel and watching it there. So thank you very much for all those who've taken the effort to join in. This particular session, like I said, is very different. And to just set the context in place, what I would say is I would break this down into today's webinar topic into 3 words or phrases. Culture being the first one, change being the second one, and the third one being culture change, which is basically a combination of the first 2. So let's look at the first one, which is culture. Culture most often is something that defines the organization. It's what people do and how they do it. Culture is all about the observable and unobservable behaviors, both on the surface and below it. Why does culture matter so much, and why do we talk about it so much? It's simply because it correlates to the performance and is difficult to copy and is unique to every organization. We all know that organizations with a healthy culture perform better, and the ones with an unhealthy culture are kind of relegated to the underperforming area. And that's probably the reason why there's so much of interest in this and why close to 500 of you have joined this webinar. The second word is change, which is basically the process of replacing something existing with something that's either new or different. Something that stops us from doing what we are currently and move to something else. Now, it's interesting when we put these 2 together and it becomes cultural change, something organizations aspire for. Being able to abandon the old ways of working and embrace new ones is something that I would call neighbors' envy, owner's pride. This quote is basically from an old Indian commercial, but it absolutely fits into an organization that's able to undertake change management and successfully implement it. The ability to kickstart change is something that's difficult to achieve for most organizations. While some leaders perceive this as a challenge, which is both intricate and time-consuming, the more savvy leaders, which includes a lot of you, kind of recognize it as an opportunity for strategic planning and effective management. But that change begins with the identification of the areas and planning for the change to be implemented, so that it's kind of embedded into the organization and the people, and that it has a positive effect. And that is where Dr. Joanne Taylor, our expert, will help us today to understand how do we look at your organization's report, how do we prioritize, and how do we plan the change management. She's been working in this field for more than 20 years and is an expert in behavior change. She will show us a tool that you can use and implement cultural change in your organization. And she will also talk about priority setting and how to use it, your organization's strength, and how to make it more competitive. My name is Benz, and I am the strategic lead for strategic. I'm the lead for strategic accounts for BRCGS and LGC Assure in the Asia Pacific region. Moving on to the next slide, which I can see has changed on its own. What companies need is to change their culture for different reasons, basically to become dynamic and adaptive. And a culture definitely can contribute to the long-term success and competitiveness of an organization. The definition of culture is right there on your screen, and I'm sure all of you have read it, but we'll kind of progress on it. So a positive and progressive culture can be a significant factor to attracting top talent, and it can also boost employee engagement and satisfaction. And I'm sure all of you who've joined in kind of have that attitude towards your organization, wanting to make that change so that it's more healthy to work, and thus you build a successful organization. But other than that, what's also important is when employees engage with the organization and work towards building its culture, the whole organization changes and starts moving towards becoming a more progressive one. And thus, the company then moves from towards a more strategic alignment with its evolving business landscape. So we at BRCGS, we have the BRCGS Food Safety Culture Excellence Assessment, which kind of provides a simple way to convert this broad concept of culture assessment into a measurable score and actionable analysis. Developed with Taylor Shannon International, an industry leader in the food safety world, the Food Safety Culture Excellence module helps organizations set new standards in the food industry. Our comprehensive survey system ensures that we gather anonymous data of the respondents, which thus promotes honest and open feedback. And our assessment generates a lot of valuable insights. And to simplify the management of this information, we've designed an online platform, which Joe will talk about in a bit, which kind of offers a host of data views. These include in-depth analysis of more than almost 20 dimensions of culture, identification of highest and lowest scoring questions, insights into positives and barriers, priorities, etc. But what sets this apart is the ability to be very flexible. All the data that's there can be viewed and filtered easily, allowing managers to tailor their analysis based on the parameters that they want to see. We work with a host of companies across the globe that stretch from multinational companies with a global network to organizations that operate as a single unit for the local market. They do the survey and reporting as they understand that these are not merely tools, but strategic assets that empower them to understand and enhance their organizational culture. They also use these data-driven insights to up their performance, and it helps them understand the industry trends and trends in their own organizations and seek interventions before it's too late. With that, brings me to the first question for Joe. Joe, what I wanted to ask you was, what are the key trends that you see these days?
Thanks, Benz. Well, we see a lot of different results across the industry, different highs and lows, different areas to focus on. But I think in general, what we tend to see is for the larger organizations and the most well-established organizations, their scoring tends to be higher in some key areas of purpose, like setting a strong vision and setting strong values and having a clear strategy in place, and also having good inner mechanisms around process. So having good systems, having the right management control and the right premise. But where we tend to see lower scores would then be in some aspects of people, such as empowerment and reward, or sometimes in the training and communication, or, and this is even more likely, some lower scores in the proactivity quadrant. So things like external awareness or organizational learning, not just the learning of the individual, to things like change and innovation. So that's a general trend we tend to see, although it is interesting the way that even within one company, we can get different patterns across different countries and different locations.
Okay. Now, you've mentioned a lot of areas: system, management control, people, training and communication, empowerment, proactivity, change management and innovation, etc. Now, how does one prioritize this?
So this is very much where having the assessment data is really crucial, because everything's important to the organization in terms of culture. All of the dimensions that you can see in this model have come from industry, have come from the research literature. But there'll be things that are more important for a company to focus on than others, and you can't do everything at once. For people in the audience that are HACCP experts, it's very much like taking a HACCP approach. We have to find where the critical things are that we need to tackle now and focus more resources on them than everything else. So it's a more effective and efficient way of managing. And when you have assessment data and you have a tool that can help you dig into it, find the little pockets of risk, the little areas of excellence that might be hidden across the company, then that's where the organization should focus their resources and lift up. It also might depend on benchmarking. There might be some areas that are much lower than the industry and other areas that are similar to the industry. So that can also inform somebody's decision in what to prioritize.
And how does one go about planning for change?
That's what this presentation will cover, I hope. When people first get culture data back and they see an online platform with lots of different views, lots of different things, it can be quite overwhelming, and it can be a case where people just don't know where to start. So what I'm going to do in this session today is take you through a couple of examples of how I would take those first few steps towards change. So yes, there's a lot more to it. There's a lot more views, there's a lot more data, but what we'll show today is just those first steps and how to take them in an effective way, one that will actually make a difference to the organization.
Okay. Do you want to show us how we can go about doing it?
Absolutely. So just to focus in on today's session, we'll be looking at the food safety culture part of what we do. When we look at organizational culture, of course, food safety is part of it. Just as we have the four quadrants, people, process, purpose, and proactivity, we also have all the different themes that are within an organization, wanting to have a strong employee health and safety culture, wanting to have a strong environmental sustainability culture. What I'll focus on today is the food safety part. But as organizations mature, what we see is that they're taking an increasingly coordinated approach and looking at these together in a combined assessment. And for our clients, this is something we have to keep adding modules for, adding more content so that when there's a new need that arises, we meet that aim as well. So this is a template we provide at the end of the survey process to show how to take those first few steps in terms of culture change. This is a simple structure. You find your lowest elements, you make plans for them, you set targets, and you document that in this formalized, structured way in order to move forward. But the first challenge, of course, when looking at this template is to say, what do I put in there? There might be hundreds of items that have popped up in the survey data that I'm interested in as a food safety expert, as a food safety professional in my organization. There might be lots of them that I'm not happy with not being perfect, and I want to lift all of them. And we see some companies putting plans together for dozens and dozens and dozens of things that they want to change. It's just not feasible. It's like going back to HACCP and being that HACCP, having that HACCP mentality and saying, I need to pinpoint the things that are most important to prioritize. So the first thing we would do is say, think generally and broadly about the area for improvement. So start looking at the categories and the dimensions. Are there any that are falling lower than the others in your organization? And the example I'm going to take today, because it's quite common. So this is an example from a company. And when they did their assessment, their proactivity quadrant was lower than the others. And especially within that, it was low for external awareness, risk foresight, and organizational learning. And the topic they were focusing on was food safety. So of all the data, we can come right down into proactivity, then down again into the dimensions. And of all the modules that the data is there to represent, we can focus in on food safety. So that's the first step in action planning. What's my topic? What's my category? What are my key dimensions? And then from there, we have to dig into the specific thoughts and behaviors that make up the change plan that we're about to generate. We can't have a change plan for risk foresight. We need to know what specific knowledge, attitude, or behavior related to risk foresight it is that we want to activate change for. So it's very important to start general and then get specific. So the first thing in the template, what's your general area? In this example, the issue was low proactivity, and the company set a general goal to try and lift up proactivity in the year ahead, focusing on risk foresight, external awareness, and organizational learning. As a next step, however, they needed to find those knowledge, attitude, and behavioral elements, individual questions within the survey that were particularly low, and to look at why that was happening and what to do. To do this, they had to go into the platform and open up the questions connected to food safety under the proactivity quadrant. And here we can see some of them that popped up. I'm showing the 6 lowest that popped up for this organization. The next step is to go through the lowest and decide which ones we want to target. We've taken out all the other modules, we've taken out the other categories, but we don't want to take 6 plans forward. Now we want to narrow down again. And we don't just always take the lowest, because the lowest might not be the one that we need to change in that particular year. It might be that there's other initiatives going on connected to it. It might be that it's not our biggest priority as an organization, or it might be something that will indirectly lift as a result of other changes. So in this example, the organization decided to start the first part of their action plan on knowledge of food safety risks. This is something that's direct, and it's something that you can create a plan for change relatively easily and in a relatively straightforward way. We want to improve the knowledge of risk. The second item they decided to look at was lessons learned from incidents being communicated across the site. Again, this is something within the control of the food safety team that they can act on and improve. You'll notice the 2 I haven't highlighted that are lower, money not being a barrier and food safety standards improving. The reason for that is the team at that time didn't have the ability to influence the finances, and the food safety standards improving is something that would be indirectly impacted by them taking these 2 direct elements from the survey. The third they decided to look at in more detail was lessons being learned from outbreaks in other companies. So these are all proactive things. These are all, if your company has a strong food safety culture, people will know where the risks are. They will share when they have problems, and they'll be looking around outside to see what other companies are doing, to see what they can learn. Staying on the front, staying proactive, these are important parts of food safety culture. And with the scores for these being low, the next step was to drop these 3 in to the lowest culture elements, and this forms the first part of the food safety culture plan. So very simply, find the ones that are important because they are both low scoring compared to the other questions in the survey, and also because they are things that it's within your power to control and change and that will have a direct impact. And what will probably happen is the others will indirectly lift around it as well. The next thing is to look at the current score. So taken as an average across the organization, in this example, we had a 63, a 67, and a 68. In the survey, this is sort of in the middle. So if it was an agreement question, this would be neither agree nor disagree. So somebody that feels there's bits of it they agree with and bits of it they disagree with. If it's about knowledge, this would be having a little bit of knowledge, but not being fully aware, but not knowing nothing. So depending on the question, it will have a different meaning, but you are somewhere where you know you need to improve. Now, that's an average. Averages are great, averages are important, but when we look just at the averages, we might miss some subgroups, some subcultures, where there's a particularly low score, where people are particularly unhappy or uninformed. This is a view that we need to go to next in the data. We call it hotspots. Different people may have different terms for it, but it's algorithms that take the demographic filters, like role, and they break it down and they find the groups where the numbers are lower. So as an example, in this case, if we look at knowledge of food safety risks, we find that where the average was around 60, the operators at one of the sites, it was around 40. So it's quite a difference. And it shows us that some groups will have lower scores, will have less knowledge or less happiness or less satisfaction than others. And it's important that we know both the average and also where some areas might be that we need to look at in particular. We can also see an example here from the same place with the supervisors. Again, the number has dropped down quite a lot. So there's two ways of looking at setting a target in terms of culture change. One is to target your averages, and one is to target your hotspots. And this will really depend on how different your hotspots are from your average. So I'll show you two examples to explain or show you how this looks in practice. So the first one, knowledge of food safety risks. We had an average of 63, but we had a couple of hotspots. So we had a couple of groups where the number was actually quite a lot lower. So it wasn't 63 where everybody is around 63. This is something that some people are in the 40s and some people are in the 80s as groups, not individuals. So in this way, the target we could set, instead of changing the average, the target we could set is, I don't want any groups being less than 60, because 60 represents having some knowledge, not none, not everything, but some. So what the organization could do is say, rather than the target being an average, the target is raising the hotspots. And that would make sense in the context of this particular item. Now, another way of doing it, so that's one way, is just to focus on the average. So if we focus on the average, we might just want to lift the general score up. But what do we want to lift it up to? If I'm going back to this idea of risk and the average is 60, what I want to do is lift my lower groups up to at least my average. But if my average is 60 and my hotspots aren't particularly low, what number do I choose for that? So another way of looking at this can be going to benchmarking. Now, in this example, the organization being a bakery, I've gone into benchmarking and I've compared this organization to all the other bakeries in the database. And what we can see is that in proactivity, the organization is doing worse than other bakeries. As an example, knowledge of food safety risks at the site is 12.9 points lower. And lessons learned from food safety incidents being communicated across the site is also more than 10 points lower. So this gives us an idea of what we might want to set as a target. It has to be realistic. We can't just put a big target in just because that's what the industry average is. But knowing that we're that much behind the industry average can be a really powerful way of motivating people to lift up to this. So what might this look like? Lessons learned about food safety incidents being communicated across the site, lessons learned from food safety outbreaks in other companies being learned from within the company. What we could do is say that the current scores are 67 and 68. My target is to lift them up to an average of 76, which is aligned with the industry average. So there's a rationale for the decision. It's also realistic. We're taking people from agreeing with this, partly agreeing with this statement, to agreeing. So it's something we just have to make very clear is happening in the organization. We should be able to lift this up to closer to 80. So the thing to bear in mind, why are we choosing the number? And is it realistic? Is it something we think we can do? And in this case, this is what the company chose, and it did make sense in that context. So I hope that gives them a little bit of an idea on how you can set targets, how you can choose which things to focus on in your culture plan. I mean, this is really very much the bigger part of it at the beginning. It's making those decisions. What is it we want to put in our plan? Why do we want to put it in? And what do we think we can achieve over the year to lift this? The next thing, of course, is to get activities that will help us. So I'm going to give you some examples from this organization. The first activity is to identify key risk messages. So we don't want people just to say, I don't really know much about food safety risk when they're working in a food organization. We want to know what information we would like them to have. So they feel that they have the information they need, but the information is the right information. So how might we do this? In this example, the first activity was to gather stories of internal incidents. So this could be done through meetings and interviews with key staff. And the idea being would be to find out things that actually impact the product and impact the company, because these are bound to be important for risk. It also is an opportunity to show that we have this organizational learning, that we're using the stories we already have. We're using the learning we already have within the company. So the same things aren't happening more than once. Another thing we could do at this step is to review the hazard analysis, make sure that the hazard analysis is up to date and it's reflected in the communications and the training going out. And what we could also do here is research into external incidents and outbreaks in companies as close to ours as we can get, where we can see things that we can really learn from. Sad to say, but learning from an event or an incident that happens somewhere else so that we can potentially prevent that happening from us as well. So the closer the type of company to our type of company, the closer it is to being a key risk message. And you can see that even in this activity alone, it would be useful for an organization and it would start to affect all three of those items in the survey. So that's the first thing they could do. The second thing they can do with this information is to discuss and coordinate with other teams in the company. For example, the health and safety or the environmental sustainability teams. Host some meetings and say, how do you communicate incidents across the company? How do you learn from external outbreaks and incidents in other companies? It might be in the survey data, you can see that these items scored higher, particularly for the health and safety team. So they would be good people to talk to. This also has the opportunity to develop more coordination across the organization, more sharing of best practices, more sharing of learnings, and also coming together and having that focus point of this particular issue, but using it to generate other ideas and other opportunities by that increased coordination. And something we see time and time again, as organizations get very large and get very complex, it's harder and harder for them to coordinate, whether that's globally or across different departments and functions in the company. We see time and time again, organizations trying so hard not to have this siloed thinking and this separate approach, but stumbling when they try and bring everybody together. So any opportunity like this that's positive, that's proactive, productive, it's a good chance to increase coordination. Finally, part of this strategy, part of this action plan needs to be looking at the messaging that's going on. We've looked at what those key messages should be. We've learned lessons from other departments, or we've identified things we need to do together. And the next thing is then to work on improving the messaging. Is it a case of updating training material with some of the stories we've learned, with some new examples, some new material? Is it a case of updating communication plans and their content? Or in some cases, is it a case of creating something new from scratch that might be really useful in helping to increase the learning of risk across the organization. So lots of different ideas here. I hope what you're noticing from these is that they're all tangible. They're all direct. They're things that you can do, that you can plan for. There's nothing in here that just says improve X. What does that mean? We have to be specific. We have to be focused. And also, hopefully, not unrealistic. There's nothing in here that's unrealistic at this stage. So obviously, when it says create new content, we would then have to evaluate how much time do we have, what budget do we have. But for a lot of this, it's steps that should be happening anyway and are really important to the organization. So we've got some activities. The next steps in the action planning template are to look at who's responsible, what are our deadlines, and how are we going to monitor. And these are classic management steps. These would be in any action plan, and they're really important for culture change as well. A couple of reasons for this. One is it keeps the plan and the people involved accountable. It identifies exactly what's going to happen, who is going to do it, by when, and who is going to monitor them. It's really important in change management. It also helps with time planning. So knowing when things will happen and when they'll be monitored will help people to plan their time and make sure that it is carved out to make these things happen. Having the deadlines and the monitoring also helps people to stay on track. And the monitoring in particular means that we can pivot as required. So monitoring all the way through the change and not just at the end of the change means that if there's problems identified early on, that can be tweaked rather than waiting till the end and finding out something wasn't as it should be. And when we talk about having different levels of monitoring and we talk about pivoting and not just waiting, this is something that's conceptualized by the evaluation triangle, something that's used in management consulting. You have your small changes having smaller evaluations, and then you have your bigger impact of the change having bigger evaluations. You don't do a small change and wait for the bigger evaluation. As an example here, if you're going to make a small change in the organization, you're not going to wait a year until you redo your survey to find out if the data changed. If you've done an activity in January, you want a small, appropriate evaluation of that activity in January. It could be as simple as getting other people's feedback. And then at the end of the year, you'd have that bigger evaluation of all the different things that have happened by redoing the culture survey. So finally, before the end of the action plan, there's a little bit more to think about, and that's positives and barriers. So there's a few things in the data that could help or hinder the action plan, and it's important to bear in mind what they are before moving into implementation. The first thing is that when we do the survey, we gather information on positives. And we always say, start with the positives in any culture change communication. Look at what's going well in the organization, look at what you can be proud of before looking at what you want to improve. And in this organization, the examples we had of positives were things like training and employee commitment. These are really important to know we have them because we can utilize them. So look at the positives you have in the organization, look at how to utilize them, link them to the overall strengths that you see across the data and celebrate them. And if something like training has come up as a positive, we know that that's a really useful anchor when we want to improve our risk knowledge. Let's go back and look at the training, which is something positive, and build on that. So training would definitely be an avenue we would use to increase the knowledge of risk. Checking on the barriers, in this case, we can see that budget and time and language came up as the three top barriers. So there's a few things we have to do. Firstly, can we mitigate them? But also, let's not make things worse. So if we're planning some communication material and we know that language is a barrier, one way of mitigating it might be to remove words, to keep things visual, or to get the appropriate translations to include the right people. But let's say one of the barriers is time or budget. We don't want to implement a plan that's going to cost people time and money because we're adding to a problem that is already perceived, and that's going to make people unhappy. So these are a useful check-in to make sure that we're using all the information we have and not making anything worse. And then finally, the action plan happens at a site level. So for example, if you have 10 factories in different parts of the world, they would each generate their own action planning template. But the regional and the global leaders also play a really important role. What do they do? So for the leadership role, we would say that while you have a unique plan at each factory, let's say, it might be that there were some trends at regional level when you aggregate the data to a region, or it might be there were some really interesting patterns at a global level when you aggregate the data up globally. And it might be that the leaders say, hey, everyone, we've noticed this trend. Although we're asking you to make your own action plan, we'd like everybody to include this item if it was below this number. And then we're going to have some meetings, we're going to have some events, we're going to work together. So it can be really useful to share topics that most people had in common and recommend work on them. It also, again, creates opportunities for people working together so that we are getting different factories together, different regions together to share their ideas and build on each other's best practices. Also, the leader's role would be to oversee how all the plans are doing and track progress. Some companies that we work with set up annual events where they bring people together to talk about their action plans. They have regular meetings where they bring different people together to see how they're getting on. So the leadership role is really quite powerful and important in supporting the site's action plans as they make their journey through. And that's everything from me. And any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Jo. It was really interesting to see in that example budget kind of come up, how we all wish that we didn't have a budgetary constraint and we could prioritize, we could kind of work on everything. But I think it's interesting that your whole session and the template that you showed kind of helped us understand how to prioritize, because with not unlimited resources, not having unlimited resources and not having an unlimited budget, I think prioritization is the number one thing. And I think that's the key thing that I am taking away from this particular presentation of yours. How do I prioritize when I have to bring about cultural change in the organization? And where do I look for? How do I look at that data? So we've got a few questions. I'd like to begin with the first one, which is on benchmarking. You mentioned that a couple of times, and we've got an interesting question here where someone wants to know what is the database that you're using for benchmarking and how representative is the information per product category?
So the database is of everyone that's taking the survey, and that involves everybody taking the survey through BRCGS. It involves everyone taking the survey through Camden BRI, through ourselves. We also work with SSAFE, and we have a module that we work with through them. So it's all the companies doing that. So it's a lot. It's a large database, tens of thousands of organizations. It's very substantial. The data is sufficient that we've broken it down into, for example, sector. And it also is sufficient that we've been able to break it down into region and country. So if you are in one part of the world, you can actually look how your data compares to other companies in that part of the world. And that's important because national culture makes a difference to data. There's some parts of the world where we just generally see higher performing sites, but not necessarily because the culture is higher performing, but because there is that respect for authority and that greater satisfaction in the way things work compared to other parts of the world where people naturally would be more critical. So we have the benchmarking, not just so that you can see how you are compared to others, but also for contextualization. How am I in my country? How am I in my sector? We also have something called best in class, where we allow companies to compare themselves to the top 10% of the database. And the reason for that is because what we find is when you're trying to get your budget holders to give you more, and you say, hey, look, we're close to the average, they might say, great, see you next year. So what we have the best in class for often is to get the red arrows showing that you're not the same as everyone else, to take it to the budget holder and say, we're not doing as well as the best in class. Look at all my red arrows. Please, can I have something? And it just helps to create that little bit of a fear factor and helps the safety and quality teams get more of what they need. So benchmarking has a lot of different purposes. Of course, within a company, we always say the most important thing is how your data compares to you. So if you have data where some parts of your culture are higher than others, that's your first and most important thing. It's how do I lift my company? But then the benchmarking, of course, has all these other purposes and useful things around it as well.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got another question. What should an organization consider non-negotiable in culture change from, let's say, from the food industry perspective?
Non-negotiable. So it's a good question. I think the first non-negotiable is continual improvement. For me, we have all seen outbreaks in very good food companies because of complacency. So no matter where you are on the culture journey, even if you're very mature, I think a non-negotiable is passionately striving to improve all the time. The safety and quality teams will never not have a vital role in a food organization, no matter how well the company is performing. So finding out where are my lows, even if my average is very high? What's changed since last year? Has anything dipped? Has any group dipped? What do I need to keep my eye on? And then even if the things that are working well, you're very happy with, the question would shift to how do I maintain them? How do I make sure we don't slip into complacency? And, it's really interesting. There are some patterns and trends in the data where you can see complacency setting in. So we have a view on the platform for risk, where you identify the level of risk you perceive in the organization. And when you get a company with very high scores and a very low risk perception, and it's a high risk product, that is a signal that you might be getting a bit complacent at that site. So that was a long answer, but I would say continual improvement. I would also say involving everybody. So don't just assess the managers. They will have a different perception of culture to everybody else in the organization. Try and get data from as many people as you possibly can in the organization to try and include everyone, and to keep talking about it. So whatever you're doing, keep talking about it, keep sharing it. We know that communication is a really key part of driving culture forward. So that's my top three. I could talk on that for a while. I like that question.
Thank you. I'm going to combine a couple of questions that we've got. Is culture excellence applicable to outside the food food industry, especially in terms of the question here is an agent and a broker? That's one. And is it applicable for small organizations?
So I'll take the second question first. So in the scale, culture, in the way we assess culture, as you mentioned right at the beginning, Ben's, culture is a shared phenomenon. It's not about the individual. And for the purposes of honest data, we need to get data from groups. So when a company is very small, you can reach a point where there's not much point doing the survey because you're not going to get group data. So if you have less than 5 people that are going to fully take the survey, you can't use it because we need more than 5 people to fully take the survey to even see the data. If you have less than 10 people at your site, and then maybe some of them don't fill it in properly, you're starting to get to that risk factor. I studied quantitative research back in the day. It's a long time. It was my least favorite subject, but I remember this sort of golden rule that we would always be looking at 30. 30 was a little bit of a magical number to try and get 30 people in a study. So what we generally say is if you're above 30, great. That's a good starting point for the survey. If you're 10 and above, do it, but bearing in mind that you might not get that same ability to filter and do different things with the data, and less than 10. Personally, I would say consider other ways of assessing culture, like qualitative methods, interviews, workshops, and different ways of assessing what's going on.
Okay.
Sorry, there was another part to the question.
Is it applicable beyond the food industry?
Yes. So we are very much in food. The whole team has worked in food for our whole careers, which is why the survey, my very, very first research I ever did back in the 90s was in food businesses. It's where every item of the survey comes from. But of course, culture is culture. And what was really interesting, a few years into launching the survey, we worked with some companies who had non-food factories. And they asked us if we could use it. And we said yes. And it actually worked really well. And a couple of years ago, we did a very large scale project in a whole range of different sectors outside of the food industry. And again, that worked really well. So the benchmarking data is largely from food, but we've seen it working very successfully in non-food as well.
Okay. And there was a question on how do you measure food safety and quality culture? And we've got the survey that's there. And Joe's just added on to it right now. There's one question here which is very interesting. And the person says that they have about 1,000 people working during the season, which normalizes to about 100 off season. What is your recommendation in terms of that they go in for a survey of 1,000 or they go in for a survey of 100 people?
So the best thing for me would to do be assessing everybody. And one of the filters we have in the demographic filter options is that we have a filter for temporary employees. So what you can do is if you assess people, you then have the ability to take the data out and put the data in, because it might be different issues. You might be looking at some different cultural patterns of your employees that are there all the time and some different cultural patterns of the employees that aren't there all the time, because everyone's working with your product. So if there's any little risk factors coming in, you do want to know about them, even if they're not your long-term employees, because a lot of what people experience in the company is about the company. So a lot of the questions in the assessment, they are designed to find out how people think and feel about the company. It's less about their personal opinions about food safety. So even if you have someone coming in and they're only there a short time, their perception of your company is still quite important. It's not going to be too much about them. It's going to be about their impression of your company.
Okay. We've got another question here which says, how do you get senior management, owners, directors involved in the culture change program?
It's a great question. It's an ongoing question because we know that culture change is really important, that it's top down and bottom up. It's got to come from what people need, and it's got to be supported all the way up and down the organization. So when you are in a position where you are in the food safety and quality team and you're very, very passionate and you have your data and you want to get that buy-in from senior people, it can be challenging depending on the organizational culture, but it's really, really important. People talk a lot about, in change management theory, creating a case for change. And one of the things that is the role of that safety and quality team is to try and get that involvement, that excitement, that buy-in. And one of the things they can do is try and create a case. Often, again, this is change management theory, people talk about that it should be negative. Now, I believe it can be positive as well, but sometimes creating a little bit of fear can be a really powerful motivator. You know, we've slipped below the industry on this. My fear is an incident like X company had a few years ago that could happen to us. This clashes with our values as an organization. This clashes with our bottom line. You know, creating that little bit of a case can be really powerful, and also just involving people as much as possible as well. So trying to get the senior teams involved in training and communication and interactions can also be really supportive, can help them to become more supportive.
Okay. There's a company that's undergone the culture survey. They're implementing their plan. How soon or how late should they conduct the next survey?
So most companies that we work with assess annually. So they line it up with all their other annual activities. There's often an annual event, there's an annual audit, there's an annual XYZ that they tie the culture assessment into, and that can be very effective, because the thing is we don't want to assess so often that we're not seeing change, especially in a very large organization. Large organizations in some ways are a little bit like super tankers, and you're trying to change the direction. It can be quite difficult. So it's going to take time. So giving yourselves a year, implementing something, monitoring it, keep coming back to it, keep going with it, and then after a year, seeing what impact it's had. That's quite powerful, especially because, as I mentioned, the little triangle, there's other evaluations you can do in the meantime. You can do little mini evaluations all along, but then this big evaluation once a year. I would say about 90% of clients that we work with assess annually. A small number do it less than annually because it fits in with their cycles of activity that they have. So some it's 18 months. One organization we work with does it every 3 years. There's only one, but that's their pattern and that works for them.
Okay. And do the teams implementing these plans, do they need to be of a specific size? Do they have to be from a particular area of operation or something on those lines?
So mostly we see that the food safety and quality, health and safety, or environmental sustainability team, depending on the modules, they're at the heart of generating the action plan. But of course, they have to work with operations. They should be working with supply. They should be working with all the different departments that contribute to the activity. And if it involves training and communication, it'd be wonderful if they were working with the marketing team to get their ideas and input. HR can be really useful if there's any part of it that involves employees, how they're feeling and their engagement. So we would say involve as many key people as you can to get the project to have its greatest chance of success.
Okay. Here's a question. So I'll rephrase it. Can the positive and barriers be the same?
Yes, because you might have, even in the same factory, some people seeing something as a positive that other people see as a barrier. So the thing with positives and barriers, the more data you put in, the more averaged your information gets, which is why in the online platform, the filtering is really crucial. Filter down until you get the patterns that are of value. Because if half people think one thing and half think the other, you need to know where those differences exist. Is it in one department compared to another? Is it in one role group? So managers all like this and then the operators all like this. So once you start to break down the data, you'll start to see. The other thing you can do, there are some topics that just sometimes people just don't agree on. So you sometimes get something where people say, yes, communication is a positive, and others, even in the same group, say, no, it's a barrier. That means there's some parts of it that are working well and some parts that aren't. So then we have to go back to the survey data, which breaks the topic down. It doesn't just say, do you like training? I mean, it breaks it down into different aspects of frequency, different aspects of impact and effectiveness. So you can find out, and a classic example, you might find that the frequency of food safety training is high, but the impact is low. Or you might find that the frequency is high, but the enjoyment is low. And when you see those multifaceted answers from the question data, it helps you to understand why the same thing can sit within a positive and a barrier.
Okay. Would it help if you kind of if let's say the organization has about 1,000 people or 1,000 employees, would it help if everybody kind of attended, went through the survey? Would that kind of create a better result, or having a specific sample kind of works as well?
So we believe that everyone should have the opportunity to take the survey, but we don't set a target of 100% in our targets, because we also give you targets so that you know when you've reached what we would consider generally a representative sample. So let's say you're at a very large site and the target you've been given is 40%, let's say, as an example. That doesn't mean you only give the survey to 40% of people. It means you give the survey to everybody. But if less than 40% of people take it, you have to keep trying and keep trying and keep trying until more do. The target can be anywhere from 30 to 90, depending on the size of your site. It's never a recommendation, and it should never hinder everybody getting the opportunity to take the survey. It's just with agency, with seasons, with COVID that we've been through, we can never say 100% of people have to take the survey, because it's just not realistic. And it puts companies in a situation where they can never end the survey because they still haven't got everybody to take it yet.
Correct. So encourage everybody to attend, but fix a benchmark and kind of when you cross the threshold, stop. Are the survey questions customizable?
Yes and no. So the survey questions are obviously, the benchmarking is such and the translation is such that customization is difficult, because if we customize too far, then we lose the benchmark. And if we customize in a survey that 70 different languages are being used, that can also become very difficult. So what we tend to do is we work with clients. I mean, also most things are covered. This is based on 20 years of research. It's constantly refined. So when people get into the survey, there's usually little they want to change. But what we sometimes see is people have a very specific program that they've been running, and they really want to know a little bit about that program. So what we do then is we build in We help them design the question, because obviously the questions are very tricky to design. So we would help them design the right structure and format of question. We'd work out how many languages they needed it in. We'd work out if there's any crossover with other parts of the survey, and then we can put a small number of additional questions in. So we do that in probably about 10% of cases at the most. We'd make some tweaks or add some questions in.
Okay. I'm just looking at the rest of the questions. I think the relevant ones we've already kind of picked up. Just one here. There's a new facility, and I'm kind of combining a couple of them. There's a new facility. How much time should they wait before implementing or starting off with the survey?
So if the new facility is a new facility with people that have moved across from another facility, then it's not going to take long because there's already going to be a cultural mindset. If it's a facility that's hired everybody new and everything is just started, then obviously we need to give it a little bit of time for people to come familiar with what's going on. So definitely I would wait a few months if it is a new facility before I would think about assessing the culture. But if it's an existing workforce that have perhaps just changed location, you don't necessarily need to wait very long. There was a really interesting case actually a while ago where a company was very unhappy with the culture at one of their sites. So they moved the entire production and all the employees, or at least a good chunk of the employees, to another location quite far away. And they found the exact same problems because they'd taken the leadership team and a lot of the employees that were with them. The facility made no difference. So, there's stories like this remind us that the culture is really impacted by the environment, but not formed or primarily shaped by the environment.
Okay. I'll do a last question because we're almost at the closing time. How do I use the survey results and the action plan in my BRCGS audit?
Do you want to take that one, Benz?
Yeah, I'll do that. Pretty easy. When you have to tell the auditor that these are the actions that you're taking, and the survey basically helps you decide how and where to prioritize. So, like Joe has been mentioning throughout the whole session, it's all about priority. We do not have infinite resources to kind of focus on. We need to prioritize where we focus, and the survey kind of gives you the answer to that, and which then leads to a plan, which then becomes an on-ground action that you can then showcase to the auditor that that's what we're doing. And not just to an auditor, not just to a BRCGS auditor, you've got buyers, you've got customers, you've got people coming in for other work. It kind of showcases your proactivity and therefore has an impact on your productivity, which kind of becomes better. I think that's it for the time being. We've got a few other questions which kind of do not relate to what we've been doing, or they've already been answered in some form or the other. So we'll kind of keep them there. Thank you so much, Joe, for giving us your time.
I'm just going to jump in because I've just seen one that I wanted to answer pop up. Have I got a minute? Somebody's talking about the survey time being long and asking if it can be reduced. And this is so topical because I am in constant balance between, as more and more modules get added and more content, giving all the different aspects of culture, but trying not to let the survey length get too long. And in the last few months, myself and my team have done another overhaul of the survey, and we have made it leaner than it was before. So it's a little bit shorter and a little bit leaner in the version that you'll see. That's going to be launched in February. So just to answer that question, it's a constant struggle because there's so much that could potentially be the thing you want to know. And if we don't ask, you won't know it. But of course, if your employees are survey fatigued and exhausted, that's not good either. So keep in touch with us, keep challenging us, and we'll keep doing our best to strive to get that balance right for you.
Thank you, Joe. That's very helpful. What's interesting is we had about 500 people, which is the threshold for our Zoom meetings, joining in and staying on for this whole 1 hour session. Thank you so much for everyone who's joined in from different parts of the world. Thank you very much. A big thank you to Kaylee from our marketing for organizing this and sitting in the background and doing all of this. Kaylee will be reaching out to you through our marketing team for additional information and with additional information as well. So if any one of you has anything, please feel free to let us know, and we'd be happy to answer that. Thank you so much. Thank
Thanks.
you, everyone. Thank you, Joe.
Bye from sunny
Bye.
London.
Bye.
Bye.